Hunter x Hunter is widely regarded as one of the greatest shonen series of all time, and for right good reason, from its intricate power system to its complex characters, and not to mention its fantastic villains. Hunter x Hunter has successfully distinguished itself from amongst its shonen peers. And since I love this series so much, I always wanted to talk about it, but I didn't know in what capacity until I decided to try broaching a topic I don't really see most people talk about. And that is, of course, biology. And as such, I'd like to welcome you to my channel. My name is Orion, and I'll be your host as I take you through the biology of the Chimera Ants. If you're watching this, I'm going to assume you're familiar with the Chimera Ant arc, otherwise there are going to be some massive spoilers. So, go watch it first. Alright then, let's begin. As with any discussion, let us clearly define some terms. So phagogenesis. The word can be broken down into two, or if you're really nitpicky, three different components. Phago, which means to engulf or consume, and genesis, which means to produce. The third component would be the O in phago. That's just the linking vowel between the two primary terms, phago and genesis. So putting this all together, phagogenesis, in essence, means to produce, or in this case, reproduce, by consuming. At this time, I'll let Kite and his gang establish what we know about this process.
先生、あの虫の繁殖方法は他の生物には見られない特徴があるからね。特徴って？
接触交配という特殊な産卵形態をとるんだ。
接触交配？何それ？
キメラアントの女王は他の生物を食べることで、その生物の特徴を次の世代に反映させることができるんだ。さらに、さまざまな生物を取り込むことで、その遺伝子が複合的に混ざり合った子孫を残すことができる。
And we see this play out throughout the series. We see the queen eat an organism, and then those traits are then passed off into her offspring. So, yeah, the name makes sense. That's exactly what's demonstrated. However, if you think about it for more than, 3 seconds if you're a biologist, it doesn't really make sense. And that's because, that's not really how inheritance works. Inheritance is essentially the passing on of favorable traits from one generation to the next. And what we see here with the queen, we don't really have a selective process. The way it works out in nature is that when a creature has favorable traits, it helps it survive. If it survives, it can mate. If it mates, it passes on those genes to its offspring, thus propagating the cycle of inheritance. If you need an example, think of a rhino's horn. The horn on a rhino helps it survive by fending off predators and competing for females. Typically, the larger the horn, the more successful the survival rate, as it's easier to fend off predators, as well as outcompete males for females. And of course, we can talk about how human hunting habits have changed the rhino's horn from advantageous to disadvantageous, but that's not really the point, and we can talk about that at a later date. Now, getting back to the Chimera Ant Queen, this is where things get interesting, because survivability isn't really the factor at play here. Quite the opposite, in fact, considering the fact that the organisms are killed and consumed by the queen, and I wouldn't like to say digested, but that has a whole slew of problems we'll get into here in just a moment. So, in essence, my question boils down to, how exactly is the Chimera Ant Queen, or more specifically her body, choosing the traits that are favorable in the organisms she consumes? In order to answer this question, let's talk about DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid is a biomolecule that resides within the nucleus of a cell. It is then processed by other biomolecules and converted into RNA, which then is translated into proteins to carry out various biological functions. In essence, you can think of DNA as the blueprint for life as we know it, which, if you're watching this, I'm willing to bet most everybody here knew that already. But what you may not have known is how DNA holds information to begin with. There are certain biomolecules known as nucleotides within DNA that hold the information needed, and these are known as adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. These four nucleotides then bind together in a specific manner, guanine to cytosine, adenine to thymine, and they form a double helix along with a couple other biomolecules we don't need to go into right now. But in essence, these 4 nucleotides are what form the code or information needed for that blueprint to actually be read and understood by other biomolecules within the cell. So a gene would be a set of information from DNA that produces one specific thing, such as a protein or an enzyme. So evidently, the Chimera ant queen must be capable of harvesting the DNA of the organism she consumes. And as such, it leads me to speculate that her digestive process isn't necessarily typical digestion, but rather part of her reproductive process. Because if her digestive process was similar to most any other organism, the genes she would need would be simply broken down to its base components, rather than the specific code she will need to pass on to her offspring. If you want to think about it this way, think of a gene as a word, while the nucleotides that form that gene as letters. In a regular digestive process, the word is then broken down into its base letters. These letters are then used to make different words for the host organism to use. However, the queen doesn't want this. The queen wants to keep the word intact in order to pass it down to her offspring, because she can't remake this same word because it's a foreign language to her. As such, the queen needs a process by which she can extract the genes and keep them intact in order to pass them off to her offspring without breaking them down to its base components, because these genes, or words, if we're continuing this analogy, can get up to hundreds, if not thousands, of letters or nucleotides long. This doesn't even address the fact that DNA is housed within the nucleus of a cell, and any digestive process that breaks down the membranes of a cell in order to get to the nucleus is obviously going to destroy the nucleus and the DNA within as well. So what we need, or more accurately, what the queen needs, is a way to break down the membrane of a cell and allow access to the genes without degrading or even destroying the DNA. So how exactly is a process like that possible? What if I told you there was a way to do this without even accessing the DNA within the nucleus? If you recall, I mentioned a biomolecule known as RNA earlier, which is ribonucleic acid. You can kind of think of it as DNA's less popular little brother. The purpose of RNA is to carry the information from DNA from inside the nucleus to outside the nucleus into the cytoplasm, where it can be processed into various biomolecules, namely proteins. So in essence, these RNA molecules carry the information stored within genes, but they don't reside within the nucleus, meaning they're a lot easier to get to than the DNA. So the queen only needs to get access to these RNA molecules. So it will be a lot easier to do that rather than utilizing a digestive process that breaks down both the membranes of a cell and the nucleus, which would ultimately result in the destruction of the DNA itself more often than not. Scientists have been able to come up with RNA isolation techniques that allow us to, do exactly what the name implies, isolate RNA from selective cells. This RNA isolation technique typically involves breaking down the cell membrane, as well as degrading all the biomolecules within, except RNA, which is typically isolated by filtration methods. So my hypothesis is the queen's digestive/reproductive system is capable of a similar process. Now, how exactly the queen is capable of such a process would be impossible to say without an actual specimen before us, and since they're fictional creatures, I think that's just best left to speculation on another day. So, the queen is capable of isolating RNA from the organism she consumes. Now what? Now it's time to introduce a molecule known as reverse transcriptase. Some of you may be familiar with reverse transcriptase. It's an enzyme found in retroviruses. What reverse transcriptase does is take a strand of RNA and makes a complementary strand of DNA from it. In essence, it creates an identical strand of DNA from the template strand found within the nucleus. We could talk about introns and exons, but for the main part, my point still stands that the RNA outside the nucleus still contains the information needed from the DNA inside the nucleus. So this is what I believe the queen is doing. She's consuming an organism, digesting the cells, and then isolating the RNA from those cells. The isolated RNA strands are then reverse transcribed into complementary DNA strands. These complementary DNA strands, now outside the nucleus, would store the same information as those within the nucleus. Then she can incorporate that DNA into the genome of her offspring. Genome just being a fancy way to say the genes within an organism. This process will not only explain how she gets her hands on the genes to begin with, but what genes are selected as well. So, to establish some things, let's talk about how DNA is expressed. Because every cell in the human body, or within any organism actually, has the entire genome within any given cell. However, if you notice, each cell is uniquely different in their specialization. If we take a liver cell and a kidney cell, for example, they're going to be different in how they're expressed. While the liver cell and the kidney cell have the entire genome of that organism stored within, only certain parts of that genome are going to be expressed. This is because the kidney cells don't need the genes of a liver cell in order to perform its function, and vice versa. As such, the RNA is only contained the information of the genes that are going to be expressed within that given cell, and not the entire genome that is housed within the nucleus. This is how I believe the ant queen is selecting genes, rather than just incorporating the entire genome of the organism into her offspring. If we take a look at how the butcher prepares the meatballs for the queen, it strips the meat off the skeleton and compiles it into one big meatball, while the skeleton is left alone. I think this is important to note because the queen doesn't eat the skeletons, and thus, she doesn't agree to acquire the genes of a skeleton needed for her offspring. Because if you think about it logically, Chimera ants are like regular ants in the fact that they have an exoskeleton, not an endoskeleton. Which endo just means a skeleton on the inside, and exo just means a skeleton on the outside. So the queen doesn't eat the skeletons, meaning she doesn't acquire the genes necessary for an endoskeleton. And why would she? She already has the genes for an exoskeleton within the chimera ant genes itself. And if we take a look at the physical characteristics of her offspring, you'll notice that it's not so much tacking on a trait from an animal onto an ant, but rather a blending of different genomes. In my opinion, it seems that each chimera ants have three primary organisms blended together: chimera ant, human, and whatever animal she happened to eat at that time. The chimera ant genes can be explained because, well, they're chimera ants. It's kind of just part of their genome. The human genes, though, on the other hand, are rather interesting because the queen ends up saying this.
変わり者か。おそらく薄くではあるが。私にも人間の血が混じっているのかもしれん。
Which may explain why the genes of a human were so easily incorporated into her offspring. It would also explain why a lot of the chimera ants are bipedal, as well as displaying higher cognitive functions than a lot of their insect brethren. The animal genes, on the other hand, can be explained by the fact that she eats most all organisms she can get her hands on, and so those genes are readily acquired through this reverse transcriptase process I'm postulating. So, to summarize my hypothesis, I believe the chimera ant queen's digestive system is combined with her reproductive system, in which RNA is isolated and converted to DNA by reverse transcriptase. The genes with the highest concentration of RNA in the cytoplasm are much more likely to be passed on to the offspring, which typically ends with the most of the animal's genome becoming part of the ants, since she consumes most all parts of the organism. This is why most ants we see are just a combination of ant and animal, and human of course, rather than just a selective trait tacked onto an ant. Now I realize there's various different biological processes we can address with the chimera ants on top of what we just discussed, such as why are the chimera ants still sexually reproducing as they imply throughout the series, to how exactly does their hybridization work, to a variety of other factors we can address. But this was just a simple video I wanted to make to discuss what I thought was happening in the process of phagogenesis. Let me know what you guys think. Add your comments down below to help me understand what I'm missing in this process. As for my next video, I'm really hoping I can crack the code on this one. It seems rather difficult. Until next time, everybody, take care and God bless.